I believe the Genesis 6 experiment took place in roughly 3550 BC. That was the days of Jared. The book of Enoch says that 200 Watcher-class angels came down on Mount Hermon in the days of Jared, Mount Hermon being at 33.33 degrees north by 33.33 degrees east from the Paris Prime Meridian. And these angels that mated with women produced first-generation Nephilim that Josephus likened unto the Titans of Greek mythology. Now, after that happened, the Watchers were judged severely for a great sin. We see in 1 Enoch chapter 10, 9 through 12, "And to Gabriel said the Lord, proceed against the bastards and the reprobates, and against the children of fornication, and destroy the children of the Watchers from amongst men. Send them one against the other, that they may destroy each other in battle. For length of days shall they not have, and no request that they make of thee shall be granted unto their fathers on their behalf. For they hope to live an eternal life, and that each one of them, the Nephilim offspring, will live 500 years. And the Lord said to Michael, Go, bind Simjaza and his associates, who have united themselves with women, so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. And when their sons, the Nephilim offspring, have slain one another, and they, the Watchers, have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them, the Watchers, for 70 generations, remember that, in the valleys of the earth, until the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated." So, we see here that the Nephilim offspring were loved by their parents, the Watchers, and part of their severe judgment was to watch their offspring annihilate each other in a massive civil war that the Greeks later stylized into what became known as the Clash of the Titans. If you've seen those movies, I think they did a pretty good job of at least capturing the essence of what we know from Greek mythology, from like the writings of Homer, Odyssey and Iliad and all that kind of stuff. So, the event, what I call the Genesis 6 experiment, that took place about 1,200 years before the flood of Noah. And then within 500 years, the first generation Nephilim had killed each other off. So that's what we see here in this graphic. Them coming down, the rule of the first generation Nephilim, 500 years. In that time, they have a civil war. Sort of early on and all that, Enoch is born. He lives 365 years. And then the end of the 500 years happens, right in here. First, we have the appearance of the Mayan calendar, the Aztec calendar stone. That shows up at 3114 BC. Then, very shortly after that, about 25 years or so after that, is the death of Adam, the first human, dies. And then, shortly after that, within 20 years or so, is the end of the 500 years. That's when the first generation Nephilim have killed each other all off. By that time, shortly thereafter, the Watchers, their parents, who had to watch their offspring kill each other off, they were judged, bound, and buried, sometime shortly after that. And then, shortly after that, Enoch is raptured, and that takes us up to about 3000 BC by the time all that has happened. And Noah's born about 78, 80 years or so after that, in a time of peace, and his name means rest. That's what Noah's name means. Well, it just makes sense. If you're born, Lamech's name meant despairing. Well, Lamech was born right in the middle of the Clash of the Titans. So if you're living through that, that's a pretty despairing time. Noah's born after the Clash of the Titans, and after the Watchers have been judged, bound, and buried, after all that's over, and after Enoch is raptured, and his name is called Rest. So, this begs the question, if the angels and their offspring were judged, why did Yahuwah wipe out the world with a flood 700 years later? Well, this is where I find value in what I call the synchronized, biblically endorsed, extra-biblical text. Genesis gives us a really high-level Cliff Note version of everything that happened. Genesis is a pretty short book, but it covers a very long period of time. But when you add in other books like Enoch, Joshua, and Jubilees, for instance, they help to flesh the story out, give you a lot more detail than what we get just in Genesis. And I published all those in a volume by the title, Genesis and the Synchronized Biblically Endorsed Extra-Biblical Text. And this particular book features an introduction by me, and it has the book of Genesis in both the King James as well as the Septuagint, side by side, like a parallel Bible, so you can compare, because there are some notable differences between the King James and the Septuagint. And then the full volume of First Enoch, the first book of Enoch, and also Joshua and Jubilees. And some people have given me flack for the cover on here, especially since I've started embracing biblical cosmology. Well, first of all, this book was published in 2013. I didn't get into even looking into biblical cosmology until 2015. And they're saying, well, why do you have a globe on the cover? Well, because this was before I researched that. But now, rather than redoing this, I'll say, it's not a globe right there. That's the circle of the Earth as just viewed at an angle. See? So this is the outer rim of the circle. And actually, it's kind of interesting because I've got this bright star right here. Back when I thought this was a globe in the universe. So now you can think of this as the sun over the circle of the Earth. So this way I don't have to redo the cover, and it's still applicable for both worldviews, depending on which one you prefer. Now, if you compare these texts right here, looking at Genesis 6, Genesis 6, 1 through 4, describes angels mating with humans. We'd already discussed in the previous session that the sons of God is a reference to angels. Now that syncs up, interestingly enough, right to this chapter and verse even, in 1 Enoch chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 7, verse 2, and of course other passages throughout the book of Enoch continuing to confirm that. And Genesis 6, 1 through 4 also syncs up with Jubilees 5, 1, and also the recap in Jubilees after the flood. There's sort of a recap of what happened that led up to the flood and the reason for the flood, and that's in the recap of Jubilees chapter 7, 21 through 23. Genesis 6, 5 through 7 shows how God feels about the resulting violence of all this activity, and that syncs up with the text you see there in red. Genesis 6, 8 through 10 reveals how Noah and his sons were genetically pure. Now, it specifically mentions Noah, that he was righteous in his generations. Well, that word used there is the Hebrew word tamim. That's the same Hebrew word used to describe like the red heifer that was pure in its genetics, doesn't have any blemishes or anything on it. So, I believe that the Hebrew is testifying to the fact that Noah was genetically pure. And we see in the book of Joshua that Noah married Enoch's daughter, Naamah. So, in Enoch, let's face it, he was about as pure as it gets. So it stands to reason then, if Noah and his wife were genetically pure, that of course his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were also genetically pure. And this syncs up with the text you see there in red. Then we see in Genesis 6, 11 and 12, the earth and all flesh had become corrupted. Now, I say all flesh, obviously with the exception of what was just described in the previous verses. So, and this syncs up with the text that you see here. Then in Genesis 6, 13 through 17, we see that God has grown increasingly angry and tells Noah how to build the ark and how to do it. That syncs up with the text you see there in red. And then we have the first mention of the wives of Noah's three sons. Now, quick quiz. Which comes first? 12 or 18? 12 comes first, right? So we don't have any mention of the wives until we get to verse 18, which comes after 12, and the corruption of all flesh. Right there. So, and this syncs up with the text you see here. And in the book of Joshua, we see that Noah chose the three wives for his three sons just 7 days before the flood. Now, you'll note that none of their siblings made it on board the ark, nor did any other family member of them. So, automatically, I'm going to just suggest that there's something suspicious going on here. Now, what was it that led to the corruption of all flesh? Let's drill down a little deeper here. Genesis 6:12 says, And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Now, Joshua 4:18 expands on this and says, And their judges and rulers went to the daughters of men, and took their wives by force from their husbands according to their choice. And the sons of men in those days took from the cattle of the earth, the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the air, and taught the mixture of animals of one species with the other, in order therewith to provoke the Lord. And God saw the whole earth, and it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth, all men and all animals. Now that syncs up to Jubilees 7:24. Now the after this of Jubilees 7:24 is the same as the after that of Genesis 6:4. In Genesis 6:4, the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also after that. After what? This is in a pre-flood context. The after this of Jubilees 7:24 is in a pre-flood context, and it's the same as the after that of Genesis 6:4, which is also in a pre-flood context. We'll get more into that shortly. And after this being the act of the angels coming down and mating with women, they sinned against the beasts and the birds and all that moveth and walketh on the earth, and much blood was shed on the earth, and every imagination and desire of men imagined vanity and evil continually. This is, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story of what was going on in Genesis 6:12. This unpacks Genesis 6:12 and lets you know more detail what was going on there. Now, interestingly enough, there's an episode of Ancient Aliens, I think it was called Alien Breeders, I believe was the title of the episode, where David Wilcock is talking about a study that was done that said something happened in 3000 BC that altered the genetic timeline, and that something happened in our DNA. He was citing the work of Dr. John Hawkes, saying something happened to our DNA around 3000 BC, and he asked the question, what happened there that changed the human genome by as much as 6%, I believe. Well, when I saw this episode, I was kind of freaking out because I'd already created this chart, and this is the expanded version of the chart I just showed you at the beginning of this session, where you had all this activity taking place. We see by 3000 BC that all this stuff is kind of wrapping up, but I believe that the first generation Nephilim, the Titans, Josephus likens the first generation to the Titans, that they had offspring also. They mated with each other and had offspring. Perhaps they mated with normal humans and created offspring. In the Greek myths, you know that there are the Titans, but then we see also that there are Olympians, sort of a next tier down version of the gods, and then they start mating with each other and create other Olympians. They start mating with humans and creating demigods and stuff like that. So you see these lesser tier Nephilim offspring showing up in multiple myths. You find the same thing, even going back to the earliest Sumerian myths and stuff like that, with Anunnaki and then the Agigi and stuff like that. So I believe that there was certainly aftermath of the initial incursion that continued throughout all this, but and that by the time you get to the last 120 years leading up to the flood, that they began to blend species together, blending animals with humans. So, all in this time period is where there's genetic manipulation taking place. Something is tampering with the genome here. And, Ancient Aliens, I don't agree with their conclusions, because their conclusion is everything in the Bible is really talking about aliens from outer space. If they just would let the Bible say what it says and mean what it says and not try to twist it into meaning what it doesn't say, their research is good. They've got some good research. I just don't agree with their conclusions. So anyway, that's what I see going on there. It was interesting to see that was confirmed in the research of various people looking into stuff on Ancient Aliens. Now, as I was thinking about genetic manipulation and all that kind of stuff, doing my research for my second book, Archon Invasion, I had these two books on my desk arranged in the order that you see here on the screen, with Doug Hamp's book, Corrupting the Image, on the left, and Tom and Nita Horn's book, Forbidden Gates, on the right. And, many scholars who look into the subject of the Nephilim, they believe that Nephilim are only the byproduct of angels mating with women. And that's certainly true, that when an angel mates with a human, you get Nephilim. However, I extend the definition to mean more than just angel-human hybrid. The word Nephilim is plural. It comes from the singular nephal, that means to cast down, cease, die, let fail, be judged, lay, cause to lie down, be lost, overthrow, overwhelm, perish, make, to rot, smite out, throw down. It's all not good. Essentially, I would distill the definition of the Nephilim into that which has fallen from the original state or kind that God created. In other words, God created everything to reproduce after its own kind, but we see that there was genetic manipulation taking place, changing the kinds. And so to take the title of these books, and this is sort of what it just kind of leaped off the table at me, is looking at these two books and the titles of these two books in the order that they're arranged here, I started to think, wait a minute, what if corrupting the image that God originally created and called good leads to opening up forbidden gates that brings about the creation of Nephilim? And as I was thinking about these things, the movie The Amazing Spider-Man came out, and in this movie, his main nemesis is the Lizard. And the Lizard was a guy who was a scientist who had lost part of his arm, and he was wondering, what's the genetic code? Lizards, that you can chop their tail off and it grows back. What's the genetic code for limb regeneration? So he starts cutting off the legs of mice and experimenting, grafting in lizard DNA to mice DNA, until finally he gets a viable subject. It works. The arm grows back, so he decides to test it on himself, and he injects his stump, and his arm grows back. Yay! Awesome! But he had an unfortunate side effect in that he became a giant animal-human hybrid, I would say Nephilim, that from that point on had only evil continually in his heart and mind, and of course was causing lots of problems for Spider-Man, who, interestingly enough, though, also is a genetic hybrid there. But, I was watching this movie and I'm thinking, wow, like that's it. That's what, because I was wondering what led to men having only evil continually in their heart and mind. Now, I mean, there have been a lot of evil people throughout history, but did they only think about evil all day long, every day? Or did they actually have tender moments with their friends and family and, in their own twisted way, feel like they were justified in the evil that they were doing? I think when it says that they had only evil continually in their heart and mind in Genesis, that really meant what it said, that something happened similar to what happened to this scientist in the Spider-Man movie. I mean, he started out with good intents, with good intentions. He was a doctor, and he lost, in the comic book, I believe it said that he lost part of his arm in combat. I think he was a combat medic or something. At any rate, he was an amputee, and of course, wanting to have his arm back like he used to have it, and wanting to help other people that have to deal with the same type of handicap. He starts off with good intent. Well, I mean, you could chop the tail off of a lizard and it grows back. So maybe if I figure out that code and I can inject it into the human genome, then people can grow their limbs back. So he starts off with seemingly good intent, but the side effect turned him into a Nephilim, animal-human hybrid, and he had only evil continually from that point on. So I believe that they're right on target. I believe that that's what was going on in the pre-flood world. And after the first generation Nephilim had killed each other off, it was the creation of the animal-human hybrids that brought them back. So that's why I refer to it as the pre-flood return of the Nephilim.